Cool. Say it again. Okay, cool.
I'm not sure why yours, but Evan said yours.
October 20th.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Good evening and welcome to today's event celebrating the publication of Tony Feher drawings by Josh Pazda. And tonight we're joined with Josh and this fabulous panel, who I'll leave Kim to introduce. A little introduction to the book. As you may know, the Tony Feher's drawings were donated to the Hammer Museum. There's just under 1,000 of them in the collection. And this book illustrates, I don't know exactly how many, but a wonderful selection of them. And there's an essay by Josh and then a discussion between our panelists who organized an exhibition of Tony Feher's drawings at Sakema Jenkins Gallery in 2016. So there are some really great reflections on that experience. And then Josh also situates the drawings in really the history of drawing with fantastic quotes from a range of draftspeople, from Dan Flavin to Paul Klee and even Da Vinci. So it's a really great introduction to Tony Feher's drawing, but also to drawing in general. And as some of you may know, Tony was an art handler at Paula Cooper Gallery from 1992 to 1996, which is kind of drawn out a little bit in the book as well, as he used some promotional materials as the kind of surface for his drawings. Which was great to see. Even the back of one price list that you can barely see the prices through from the 90s that I recognize because I look at them every day. And it's really great materials. And yeah, I'll let everyone else continue, but I'll just introduce Kim Conaty, who is the Stephen and Anne Ames Curator of Drawings and Prints at the Whitney Museum. Prior to joining the Whitney, she was a curator at the Rose Art Museum and the Museum of Modern Art. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Grace. Wait, should I be talking to this or the one I'm holding? Okay. I'm going to pass this back to you. Okay, can you all hear me okay? Yes, excellent. Thanks so much for that introduction, Grace, and I'm so happy to be here to celebrate the publication of this beautiful, still quite new publication, Drawings Tony Feher, published by Gregory Miller and Company. And I want to extend a warm welcome to those of you joining us here at 192 Books, and also to those of you joining us remotely. As Daisy noted, tonight's discussion is a very special celebration of this book because we have all of the authors and participants here together. So it's a great opportunity to really dig into Tony Feher's work through the reflections of this close group. So for any of you who have had the chance to flip through this book, and if you haven't yet, I hope you will have a chance to throughout this evening, you'll see that it reveals a side of Tony's work that is underknown, personal, expansive, and revelatory. And I realize that these are words that I often use myself when describing artists' drawing practices. So although Feher is perhaps best known for his sculptures and installations that bring everyday objects together in unexpected and poignant ways, his drawings add very, very importantly to this story. In this book, through a wonderful introduction by Josh Pazda, an illuminating conversation between four friends, Nancy Brooks Brody, Joy Episalla, Zoe Leonard, and Carrie Yamaoka. I had it right before and then I messed it up. And nearly 150 consecutive pages reproducing the drawings themselves, it's clear that drawing was a through line in Feher's life and work, a private daily practice that provided a place to think, plan, experiment, and play, or in other words, a map of his mind, as Zoe Leonard proposes in this conversation. I'm going to start tonight's conversation with short introductions to the panelists so that we can get into the discussion further. And I'm going to go down the line closest to me and then down to Carrie at the end. I'll start with Nancy Brooks Brody, who is an artist born, raised, and working in New York City. Brody's practice employs the physicality of materials and location. Using math and measure, her drawings and paintings engage the boundaries of the plane or surface itself, and her site-specific work activates the cubic volume of the room. Zoe Leonard is an artist working with photography, sculpture, and installation. She's exhibited widely since the early 1990s, and as I'll discuss in a minute, is a founding member of the queer art collective Fierce Pussy, which is true of all of the panelists, in fact. Carrie Yamaoka is a New York-based visual artist. She's interested in the topography of surfaces, the tactility of the barely visible, and the chain of incidents that determine the outcome of the object. Her work engages the viewer at the intersection between records of chemical action, reaction, and the desire to apprehend emerging and fleeting and unstable states of transformation. Lastly, Joy Episalla is an interdisciplinary artist whose work repositions photographic and moving image practices into the territory of sculpture. Episalla is based in New York and is a longtime AIDS activist. So, as I got a little bit ahead of myself before, these 4 artists are also the founding members of the queer art collective Fierce Pussy, which was formed in New York City in 1991 through their immersion in AIDS activism during a decade of increasing political mobilization around gay rights. The collective responded to the urgency of those years using low-tech and readily available resources, such as old typewriters, found photographs, and printing supplies and equipment accessible in their day jobs. A presentation of their work, entitled Arms, Ache, Avid, Aeon, Nancy Brooks Brody, Joy Episalla, Zoe Leonard, Carrie Yamaoka, Fierce Pussy Amplified, just opened at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. And now quickly onto Josh Pazda. Josh is an art historian who lives and works in Houston, Texas. He holds an MA in art history from the University of Houston and is a partner at Josh Pazda Hiram Butler, a contemporary art gallery with a cross-generational program that presents contemporary and historical artworks in a manner that focuses on connoisseurship and beauty. I really like that. That was a nice line from your bio. As I mentioned, Josh played a key role in this publication, and I'm going to pass it over to him now to talk a bit more about Tony's drawings and this book project.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. This is so nice to see so many friends, and what a warm welcome for this special engagement that has been long in the works. And can everyone hear me if I speak at this level? Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So I'm fortunate to work with so many great people in this book that I feel like, first and foremost, there are several folks I need to acknowledge. So I'll start there. And then I'm going to do a kind of a very broad overview of the content of the book, and then we can kind of kick into conversation together. First and foremost, our hosts here at 192 Books, Peter, Evan, and Lisa, thank you so much for hosting us this evening. It's truly wonderful to be here. Also, the Paula Cooper Gallery family, Paula Cooper, Lucas Cooper, Steve Henry, Anthony Allen, Christopher Haynes, Daisy Charles, you guys are the best. And as Daisy mentioned, Tony worked at the gallery as a preparator in the early to mid 90s. I know that was a really formative experience for him, and he always held the gallery in the highest esteem. As she also mentioned, a lot of Tony's drawings were made on the backside of discarded letters that he fished out of the gallery's wastebasket. And most of these were letters to artists and clients that had typos, or perhaps a daily special lunch menu that was faxed to the gallery. And this is back when a roast beef sandwich only cost $6. Thank you to our publisher, Greg Miller. From our very first phone call now almost 5 years ago, Greg has been enthusiastic, supportive, and a great communicator who didn't hesitate shepherding a first-time author as myself through the process of publishing. So I'm very grateful for Greg. And also on Greg's team, Alexander Johns has been an incredible help. And thank you to Alexander. Brody, Zoe, Carrie, Joy, it's an honor to be on this panel with you. And I'm so happy we had the chance to collaborate on this book together. From Tony Feher's estate, I'd like to thank Andrea Blum, Rebecca Camacho, Tony Meyer, and Brent Sikkema, who have all generously supported this book from day one. Thank you to Meg Malloy, Scott Briscoe, Michael Jenkins from Sikkema Jenkins Gallery. This book looks as amazing as it does because of the eye and mind of Joseph Logan, who designed it. He made the material come alive, and I think you'll agree that the drawings feel so present on the page. Thanks also to Anna Maria Morris on Joseph's team. At the Hammer Museum, Connie Butler has been a great advocate, and I'd like to thank her for giving me the courage and blessing to take on this project. And back in Houston, thank you to Hiram Butler. Hiram started working with Tony in our gallery back in 2002, and this is how I had the opportunity to know Tony. From about 2010 onward, Tony was spending a considerable amount of time in Houston because Claudius Schmuckle was organizing his 25-year survey exhibition at the Blaffer Museum, which was mounted in 2012 and traveled to 5 venues in the United States through 2014. In November of 2013, I visited Tony in the studio. This is right around the time of his survey exhibition was mounted at the Bronx Museum, and hard to believe that's now 10 years ago. We looked at sculptures that he was working on. Tony's studio was always a world of discovery. There was an endless collection of objects, and it could be hard to tell where the art stopped and started. The real discovery that night was a group of black 3-ring binders sitting on a tabletop, each one filled with hundreds of drawings that were individually contained in plastic sleeves. What he was beginning to assemble with great interest was a collection of drawings that spanned from 1985 to the present. I was really stunned because I had never seen one of Tony's drawings before, and I don't think I even knew that he made drawings at all. And I would learn that I was not alone in this regard, and that virtually all of the curators, collectors, and friends that he worked with over many years did not know about his drawings. Our mutual understanding of his process of making sculpture was that he intuitively assembled ready-made objects in simple arrangements and would tinker with them for a period of months or even years before determining that a work was complete. And while that understanding was mostly accurate, it was astonishing to learn that drawing played an essential role in his creative production. Thinking about the timing of that visit, it seems natural that the drawings appeared in a period when he had been thinking retrospectively about his work and career. Because the drawings span his career, one might have expected that they would have fit in perfectly to a 25-year survey exhibition of that kind. So I was surprised to learn that the material had not been put forward for consideration for inclusion, let alone simply making it known how they fit into the context of his work and artistic production as a whole. It was clear, though, from that first visit that this was a work in progress and that it was intended to exist as one entity. It is tempting to think of this as an archive, which is a word that Tony expressed an aversion to, and shame on me for using it in my essay. Archive might imply that these drawings were all self-contained things rooted in the past. And while the drawings are an incredible glimpse into Tony's mind, life, and work in the past, I think that what he was assembling was more like a monumental sculpture that was very much rooted in the present. And I want to bookmark that thought, and I'd like to return to it in the conversation because I think all of you would agree. And in fact, the title of your conversation in the book refers to this, titled In the Present Tense. At the time of his death in 2016, Tony had assembled a collection of nearly 1,000 drawings that spanned 30 years. They were never exhibited in his lifetime, and as a result, the literature on his work makes no mention of drawing. Along with Andrea Blum, Brody, Zoe, Carrie, and Joy curated the first posthumous exhibition of Tony's work at Sycamore Jenkins in the fall of 2016. They included all of the drawings, as well as a selection of new paintings. It was the first and only time that these drawings have been publicly exhibited. And from that remarkable exhibition, the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles acquired the entire collection of drawings as a gift of Tony Feher's estate. I imagine just about everyone here knows Tony's sculpture, but unless you saw that exhibition at Sycamore Jenkins, chances are you may not be familiar with the drawings. So I'll give a quick recap here just so we're all on the same page before we dip into conversation. The drawings are all modestly scaled, not often larger than a sheet of typing paper. And you remember he was organizing them in 3-ring binders so you can keep the plastic sleeve in your mind as a scale reference. They all had to fit into that sleeve. The majority of them are drawn with black or blue ink or graphite on paper and depict the objects that he used in his sculptures across a range of the following basic types. Drawings for sculptures that can be identified and still exist today. Drawings for sculptures that are no longer extant or never came to fruition, including a number of monumentally scaled public works. Drawings for the layout of exhibitions, there are about 200 or so of these, And especially with his site-determined works, drawing played this crucial role to help him think through what he might install in a given space. So there are plenty of examples where you see several iterations of a similar idea. And these examples are kind of peek into his thought process where you can see him toggle back and forth between thinking, seeing, and making. And lastly, word drawings. These can seem as the kind of wild card in the group, but I think that they have a kind of sculptural logic. So you can think like serially repeated words that are stacked, like cute boys, cute boys, cute boys, or the words why me repeated 26 times. One of the greatest revelations about the drawings is that they introduce a so far completely unknown element in his work, which is an autographic line. Whereas the sculptures are generally ready-made objects that are assembled in architectonic arrangements and you don't see the trace of his hand, the drawings are all about the unique touch of his hand. And to be sure, he was not an exquisite draftsman in the traditional sense. He loved to retell a story about a high school teacher who... He loved to retell a story about a high school teacher who leaned over his shoulder one day in class and proclaimed, "Mr. Feher, your drawing is wrong." And as wrong as they are, the majority of them are signed and dated, so we know that he wasn't too shy about his drawing sensibilities. I mentioned earlier that he relied on his intuition when assembling sculptures, and this had a direct impact on how he drew. The drawings are almost always quickly rendered and don't have precisely planned details like the minimalist artists with whom he's so often associated. Without exception, the drawings are made on everyday paper supports, and this includes paper napkins lined in graph paper, discarded correspondence, flyers and posters for ACT UP events, hotel stationery, lunch menus, and paper placemats. I find this to be a profound aspect of his drawings that underscores his career-long commitment to utilizing ready-made objects in his work. And even more interestingly, perhaps, it establishes a chronology of his life and work directly in the drawings. And in them, we can see where he worked, where he traveled, which hotels he stayed in. And one day it could be the Holiday Inn in Clinton, New Jersey, and the next day it was the Carlisle. Where he made art, where he had drinks and dinner, what political activism he was involved in. And examples like the drawings on Paula Cooper Gallery letterhead that I mentioned capture a kind of broader cultural snapshot of the time. Several commentators have noted that not many of the sculptures tell us of the artist's private life. While that may be true of the sculpture, we definitely get a glimpse into his private life in the drawings. The drawings are smart and funny and as beautiful as Tony was. And I think thinking about the material supports that he was so consistently choosing for his drawings, it's interesting to think how they emphasize drawing as object. So the drawings depict sculptural objects, and then the material support emphasizes drawing as objects. So there's this kind of toggling back and forth between sculpture and drawing. And one consideration that's come up for all of us, I think, consistently is that these works are decidedly sculptors' drawings. And I think it's an interesting idea, and I wondered if maybe that was a place where we could open it up and pass around some ideas.
Well, there are sculptures. I mean, they're all about the line, right? And they're very about all the things that Tony would just pick up on the street are fine. But not only is he drawing them, to me, they work in space, the drawings. They're very, they talk about the space and what he suspended his work, you know, like suspending the... Can you hear me now? Okay. So what I've been thinking about, actually, in reading your book again and just looking at the drawings, is how much the drawings are like sculpture also in their spatiality and the way in which, you know, I think even you talk about it too, but I was thinking about how, like, you know, a line isn't necessarily to the edge of the page, right? So it suggests a kind of infinity. And I think Tony's work, the sculptures suggest a kind of infinity, or an on and on and on, because all of the kind of objects he's also using are, you know, always very ubiquitous and in the world all the time. So I think that there's a real play between how he wants to describe, but also I think that they're spatial is not totally the word, but they're almost like little sculptures in themselves, not just because of the material that they're made on, but almost like drawing in space, which talks about architecture. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that even though I think they're sculptors' drawings, there's a surprising lack of any kind of measurement or specifications, which is interesting because they're so direct and they're so very much about contour and not actually rendering. There's no shadow, there's no shading or, articulating a form in the round. They're very, to me, they seem quite flat. I don't know. But they also, then there's the most basic hints of perspective, like there'll be the lines of the room or something like that, or the table. But it's very, very rough and raw.
Carrie, in the interview, I love this line, which relates to what you're saying, where you describe the drawings as being without flesh.
Yeah,
that
because
was so beautiful.
Because I feel like the sculpture it's all about a kind of corporeality, and the drawings are very, very stripped down.
I'm going to share a drawing in the book on that note, which is this one here, which sort of charmingly looks like a skeleton in a bell jar. And the text reads, "Portrait is the artist's defleshed skeleton, 1956 through 20, and then 2 blank spaces for whatever the end would be." But I love that the drawings are without flesh. The sculptures are fleshed out. And here's the portrait of the artist's defleshed skeleton.
Do you want to say more to that? Or? It's so funny because I totally agree about the stripped downness, but maybe it speaks to the range of the drawings in that I think of a lot of them as almost architectural. And I think when when you said about him not being an exquisite draftsperson, I actually think he was an exquisite draftsperson in that with very few lines, in a very stripped down way, he could evoke a situation that has volume and weight. And some of them are very flat and there's a lot of jokes. And I mean, when you're talking about 1,000 drawings, there's a huge range. But frequently the ones that have to do with planning towards an artwork or imagining an artwork or taking notes towards something, in very few lines, he gives you a whole sense of dimension. And Tony was a student of architecture also. He was really interested in classical architecture, and he thought a lot about how space is constructed. And I think that really comes through in his hand. And for me, it's more than just the diagrammatic. They're really spatial, as Joy was saying. And related to maybe this thing about the question of, I don't quite know how to say this, something that strikes me over and over again about Tony's work and its reception in the world is that there's often been a critical focus on the materials that he uses, that he picks things up from the street, that he uses these ready-made, very quotidian objects. And Tony also was very prolific, and he worked with a real fluidity. He made a lot of work. His studio was this kind of unbelievable place. And I think that sometimes that belied his rigor, that the work was often talked about in certain terms, and there wasn't really a full understanding of what a truly exquisite artist he was, how deeply he looked at art history and architecture history, and how rigorous the work really was. And that, I think, is why this book was such a brilliant project, Josh, that you focused on this, because I think in these drawings, you do see his mind working, and you understand that it wasn't just every shiny bit. He might have picked up every shiny bit off the sidewalk or the beach, but how he thought about arranging them was deeply rigorous and deeply thought through and felt through. I'm not saying less heart, but I'm just saying there was a tremendous mind at work here.
I don't really think I have much to, what to add. I was going to say what I was thinking about was some of the very first drawings that are in the book and that are in, we hung the show chronologically. The book isn't exactly chronologically put together, which I really like.
Yeah, I mean it's mostly chronological, but we did pull rank on a couple of drawings to make
which
really compelling.
Yeah. But we chose to hang the show that we mounted chronologically. But I was thinking about some of those that when early on, before Tony worked at Paula's, where I met him, we met at Jennifer Bartlett's before he left to go to Paula's. And two things, the project that we were working on when we met was her series of houseboat fence, which were these meticulously, Jennifer was in Paris. I was brought on to do all the finishing work to the sculptures. And it was George Stoll, Tony, David Knutsvik, and David Nelson working together in her studio on Lafayette Street. And I was brought in to do the finishing work. And these pieces were all taken from, they were three-dimensional objects taken from a two-dimensional plane. So they're made in perspective. And that freaking technique that went into making these they're unbelievable. I don't know if people remember seeing them, or like there's double boats and there's houseboat fence, house fence. And well, you can look it up. I mean, it's probably a book here, but the skill and craft that it took to make these sculptures and the drawings that were made to render them into physicality, much of that was Tony. And, that he could make anything. Tony could build anything. He could make anything. And, he chose in his work to not use the normal artist's tools of the trade. And the same thing with the paper that he picked to do these drawings on. They're not, and you talk about that as well. It's not fine artist papers. They're also like his sculptures. They're the everyday, the napkins. Tony, if you saw Tony's studio, there was no stove, there was no fridge. It was all his apartment. His apartment was his studio. It was like later he had a studio, but his apartment was the studio. And so every surface was covered with possible artworks. We could go on about that, but I lost my train of thought about why I was mentioning that. The paper, thank you. So he didn't eat any of his meals at home. He wasn't cooking at home. So there's tons of napkins because he's sitting alone in coffee shops, drawing, talking about the guy next to him. And I think he loved the physicality of that napkin also, and the stains on it and the folds, or I try to say, and I don't say it very well, but that edge of the napkin folded, there's a formal aspect to that. And him putting it into I'll just say back to like working at Jennifer. So we spent massive amounts of time together, massive. She wasn't there. She was in Paris. So we just took over her house. And took care of it, but we would watch TV at 3 a.m. I mean, we had all kinds of hours that we just kept. And I remember walking along going on the piers with him. And this is like before Tony was really making work. He hadn't found the marble yet, which like lit such a fire in him. But I remember walking out on the West Side Highway piers and looking back at the World Trade Towers, and Tony telling me this idea that he had, that he wanted to take all the windows and put gels in them, or and create a sculpture out of the tower. And it's like he was wanting to utilize something that was already there for him to, I mean, he talks about, here, thank you. So that's really early. What year is that?
85.
85. Okay, I met Tony, I think it was 87, early 87. I was like 25, I think, when I met Tony. Anyway, him telling me and pointing at that and dreaming, and it changed my whole way of thinking. I mean, I remember it was like, I mean, it's not, no pun, but it was like a light came on. And I feel like, and it never happened, obviously, but Tony really tried to make that project. And I feel like back, circling way forward, when he got to all that blue tape work that he did, that was a kind of realizing of that. But I feel like I'm talking too much and getting off track. But I'll just say that for me, what Tony did, and what I just, as a human being and also as an artist, he would take things and show you another way of looking at it. And, you know, in all Tony's work, because it's sculpture, maybe it's different for the drawings, but there's not one vantage point to see from or look from. And I mean, so many people, like said, they think it's a Tony Feher, but it's not a Tony Feher. You know, it's just not. But he helped me see the world so differently as a person and through his work, and then to come upon his drawings and to see that World Trade Tower one first, but also just that line over and over again with the weight of the bottle. You know, that is, there's so many of those drawings, and he loved working with that material, and it's so much about drawing in that work, that line, you know, that line of that pink pole, right? That's like, and the idea of this, you know, the liquid in all these, it's like level, it's this level line, and the level is the sculptor's tool, the builder's tool, you know. Anyway, sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I add something really quickly that relates to that with the drawings of the hanging bottles? Because I was thinking before coming over here about the Whitney's sculpture of Tony's in our collection, which is Suture from 1997. And I found in our files this artist questionnaire that he had filled out that same year. It was acquired in 1997 as well. And there's a great line, because I guess he was asked about were there drawings, and he wrote, "Concerning drawings, there are probably several sketched on paper napkins somewhere in my studio, but I don't exactly know where they are. No writing or formal drawings exist. As you can tell from this scribble, I'm no writer. I work in a visual medium because that is how I can best express the vision I have." So, and there they are in the napkins in this book that we can see.
That's amazing. Just to add on top of this group of drawings that he made for a project at the World Trade Center, the first image in the plate section is it's the earliest drawing in the book. It dates from 1985, and it's a Xerox copy of, I think, a postcard of the World Trade Towers at night. And what he did is he took a blue highlighter and then just highlighted all the windows of the South Tower. This was a project that sustained his interest for decades, and it was 5,568 blue rectangles project for the World Trade Center in New York City. And his vision for this piece was to take blue window gels and put them in every window of the South Tower, and that all the interior light energy would shoot out. And evidently as you can see from these drawings, that blue light is going all the way to Connecticut and New Jersey and just way out. But yeah, exactly. So
basic footprint of projection and proposed viewing area. This is from '99, so 2 years before the towers go down. But, yeah.
And the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council had programmed artworks and a residency at the World Trade Center site. And in Tony's notes, he had this whole box that was just full of like World Trade Center ephemera postcards and articles and architectural plans. I think it really fascinated him. And notes for people who worked at the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. And I tried to get in touch with them to see if there were any kind of conversations that had traction, and I couldn't find out. But it was interesting that he was in tune, at least that they were programming that site. And then there's one drawing later that Joy mentions in the conversation of the book where he's thinking through this assembly of wooden pallets, and you see them in different arrangements, and then and they span like, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks, something like that. And then the last one is inscribed after that day, September 12th, 2001. And you see one side of a wooden pallet kind of flipped up on its side. And as Joy noted, it sort of looks like the filigree that peeled off the front of the World Trade Center tower.
I was just thinking about that. When you're saying, about the World Trade Center and then all the blue tape pieces that Tony did in the windows. So he was able to get that gel and make that happen. And I think that's the other really incredible part about Tony, is because he not only saw how things work together, but he could, bring something from 1985 all the way forward through the work. He doesn't forget anything. He's super smart, and he's able to visualize, like see it yet again, which I think is really fascinating and all encompassing. And then all his building blocks, right? I mean, if you went to his apartment, which Zoe and I both spent an enormous amount of time there after Tony died photographing it. And what we both realized is it's like it was his laboratory. So, we were there on a very hot day, and the air conditioner had been removed for some reason, and we were there for hours. And at some point we were both totally wiped out. It was about 4:00, and we just both crapped out on one of the couches because he had this like L-shaped thing going on in the living room. And we're laying there, and I smoked a lot of pot with Tony, so we were like very close that way, and could really relate. And so Zoe and I are like this, and then we looked up, and it was like, oh, there's fairy lights. And then Zoe was looking around like, where? How do we turn them on? And then we turn them on, and the whole place comes alive. It's Tony talking to us, and I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, he's really stoned. And he's looking at these things that he's making, and he starts to see how things are connected to each other. And then he takes that, like he'll have like maybe the first example of something, but then it goes to the studio, when he had the big studio up in the Bronx. And there again, you start to see this well of how he starts to not only embrace things, but open them up. And I was thinking about the napkin, and I was thinking about, I'm going to forget the name of the piece, the pink. What was it called?
Blossom.
Blossom, which was insulation material that if it was, laid on itself, but he played with them. Where I remember going to a studio visit up in the Bronx, and that place had these like little Warren areas, and so he had blossoms set up, and so they'd be like these big fans. But that folding is the napkin folding. Do you know what I mean? So not only does he open up and see the crease, but he's also super interested in what that is, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and deceptively simple.
Yes, but it's not simple at all. It's super smart.
Yeah.
I think to add to that, also, for many years, he was interested in what the shape of a cardboard box would make whenever you unfolded it.
Right.
And, Advil, whatever,
Everything like and,
Veuve Clicquot, like all sorts of boxes. And
yeah, all of
Yeah.
his medication.
And so oftentimes they're spray painted a solid color. Many of them are covered in glitter. And it's interesting to me to think about the way that these things get categorized and live out in the world, because they are paper, right? And it seems that any work of art that is on paper or is made of paper gets categorized as a drawing. But Tony had this like very strict idea that these are not works on paper, they're works of paper. So it's not drawing, it's sculpture. And the fact that it needs a frame to live on the wall is sort of like not his problem. But then at the same time, he doesn't have any trouble, realizing these exquisite line drawings in space, right? So much of the sculpture, I think, is really drawing in space.
Yeah.
I would. Oh, good. No, I this kind of ties in. I wanted to go back to a moment to where Nancy left off, where Brody left off. I met Tony right around that time as well, through you, Brody, at first, and then, when a friendship is meant to happen, then I met him through all these other ways, shortly thereafter. But I remember at the time he was painting, and at one point you and he did a show together, and Jennifer Bartlett had bought the new building, Charles Street, and was not yet moved in, and you and Tony had an exhibition there. And Tony had some of his paintings there. They were very formal kind of considerations of the cube and the parallelogram, and they were like drawings in a certain way. But there were also these objects that were like a piece of, sorry, what do you call it again? The metal thing that when you're going to put lath, like the metal,
Chicken wire.
like chicken wire, but it wasn't chicken wire. It was like when you're going to, like that metal lath that you put up. It's not lath, that's the wrong word. Yeah, like a metal mesh that you use in construction. And they were just kind of curved into a slight bowl shape. And there were a couple marbles and some feathers. And this was what he was really excited about. And I was like, huh? But he was like this, but Tony was like a great advocate for his own work. Very incredibly, for those of you that didn't know him, I mean, the most charming human being. Talk your ear off and you'll love it until the cows come home. But I was like, oh, what are these things? They're not quite a sculpture. But they stayed with me, I think, partly because he was so interested. And then shortly thereafter, I think he let go of painting at that moment. I don't think he ever returned to painting. And then slowly in his house, you would start seeing these like sort of poured concrete pieces with bottles stuck in them. He started playing with all of these different things in that apartment before he had his studio outside. The apartment started out with one room that was the dedicated studio. It was like a kitchen. It was a 3-room apartment and the bathroom. Let's not forget that. So 4, because it was right. Exactly. 4 rooms. Anyway, there was at one point one of the rooms was the studio, and then really all of it was the studio. And over time, there were just like layers and layers and layers of like every Mardi Gras bead that's ever been made, every wig, every figurine, every single Christmas light. Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Then there's that. Then there's the wardrobe in the other room. But everywhere, like Joy said, he he was always, I think, part of what people didn't see and didn't get about the work that looked so inevitable, like these things that looked like, oh, sure, they seemed like they'd arrived so easily in the world. And Tony was the kind of guy that like you never let him see a sweat kind of thing. But it was these hours and hours of trying things out and being like, oh yeah, whether it was with turning a potato chip bag inside out and using a hole puncher to make a pattern. But he would try things dozens of times and then smoke a tremendous amount of pot and stare at them. So in his apartment, there were so many like mobiles, a lot of things that hung. He was really interested in that. So there were a lot of things that would sort of move with the slightest movement of air, hangers with things hung on them that would lightly twirl. The plastic bag, I mean, good God. And one other thing I wanted that Brody made me think of is this way of how he made you see things you see every day, see them really differently. After spending a day with Tony or seeing his work anywhere, this thing would happen where my eyes would register things differently. I mean, to this day, sometimes like often in Chinatown, all of the vegetable markets will have the same colored plastic bag as their bag. And at one point it was like this orangey red. And at a certain time of day, everyone walking around with their groceries had that color and the sun was at a certain angle. And I would just be like gobsmacked, like just absolutely stunned. And I don't think that's something I would have seen without Tony. It was like this sensitivity, this fine tuning, and it was extremely formal. There was a lot of heart. There was a lot of poetry. They were, but there was this incredible formal sets of ideas about color, about shape, very much about light. We talked a lot about the Renaissance and light, and he was churches, stained glass. And he did a really magnificent project with blue tape at the Hagia Sophia. Like one of the only contemporary artists I know that would like march into the Hagia Sophia like, this is the space. Like, oh, I've been invited to the Istanbul Biennale. Give me the Hagia Sophia. You know, that was like the scale that he thought on. And then his gesture, there was one small blue tape line making a horizon line in one of the kind of, nave is the wrong word, but one of the kind of bays upstairs. And then one milk jug. Like the gesture was incredibly fine-tuned and honed, but the ambition and the understanding was like, he understood what the Hagia Sophia was, and he wanted his work in that lineage and in that architecture.
And there are several drawings in the book too that work through these ideas of what he might have installed in that space, and none of them reflect what he ultimately chose to do. Yeah, but it's interesting, you know, that they exist as drawings, so we can kind of get in his head a little bit.
Right, he was thinking and working, and he was like on paper trying to figure it out. And then when he went there, it was just, he had a whole nother epiphany, and we went with it. He trusted himself tremendously. Yeah, I mean, even just, I don't know if people can see, but there's just a coil of it from this here on the wire here. And that's, you know, those tubes that he filled with liquid for I think it was his first show at Pace. Yeah. And they were drawings, you know, he figured out, he just used an empty tube, filled it with food coloring and water, and a book, kind of one of those clips that you use for your book, for, you know, black and silver clip. And he was able to control a little bit the amount of air that was in, so that the way that the water would be and the liquid in the tube, the color. Anyway, this, yeah, I mean, it's everywhere when you see the world. Tony's always with me that way as well. Just think it also just the formal aspect of his eye. He was around Paula's gallery all the time, to like that just had to seep in, the Judds and the Andres, and yeah. In thinking about his studio, and it's so crazy hard to, I mean, you guys should make a book of those photographs. People wouldn't believe that work came out of that place. I mean, thank God Tony was an artist, because if you went to his house, you would be like, whoa, what the hell is happening here? And yet these incredible, and I mean, what, you couldn't move through his apartment. I mean, it was intense. And eventually his studio was like that too. Like, it filled right up.
And it was a huge studio.
Huge. He was a terrific collector of, and Tony didn't have it was high and low. It was like a piece of whatever from the street, a candy wrapper, a top of a bottle, to like very fine,
Jade.
yeah, the collection of jade, silver. He could go on about Mima and his life in Texas, and like, he could be such a snob, and yet,
Don't get me started.
yeah, I was avoiding that. But and rugs. His interest in rugs was another engagement, and he went deep into his subject. And Tony he knew so much about architecture. He knew so much about history, science. Tony knew how things worked. He was fascinated. He was a student of the world like what we would consider nature, from plate tectonics to man-made, how electricity works. And Tony was like being among all these books. Like, Tony didn't read books. He didn't read novels. He didn't read stories. He didn't go to movies. He didn't go to Broadway. But he would, watch a ton of television, like massive amounts of trash TV and major documentaries. Like, his range, I'm just trying to, like, the range of his work, the range of his thinking, his way in the world was, it's so much of what came out of the studio into the world came so through him. He's so present in all of his work, the quality of his hand in all of those drawings, his signature, Tony, sometimes it's just Tony 07, or, and that stamp too that he chose with his address on it. Tony was very specific. It was like, yeah.
Something just occurred to me, actually, which is that Tony did this really incredible show maybe 15 years ago at Wesleyan in the Zilka Galleries, which was a really signature show that I think there was like this incredible kind of confluence of the very, very formal aspects of his work and the kind of deeply evocative poetics and emotions in his work. The piece was called Siempre Contigo. It's a brutalist building from the mid-70s, limestone block. And when the building was first built, they would sink anchors into the mortar lines between the block, and that's how they hung artwork. But at a certain point, because it was a historic structure made as a museum, but yet you can't hang anything from the wall. They stopped allowing that. So when Tony was invited, so you had to hang things from the existing anchors. So Tony found every single anchor in the whole place. We're talking hundreds. And with a very simple twist of wire, small clear bottle with water, these kind of incredible like bunches of like clear grapes. Like it was the most dialed back minimal piece, and yet it was the most Baroque piece. And by pulling out this kind of history of every show that had ever happened there in this incredibly subtle and non-hierarchical way, it was rigorous, it was educated, but it was also just like so deliciously, glitteringly, beautifully, like satisfying to be in that room. Our wonderful friend Carrie just had a show there. And we spoke a lot about this. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts about that show and working in that space and kind of connection, like things that came to you.
Yeah. So I went up to Wesleyan last summer a number of times in preparation for a show that I just did there in January. And I looked at photographs of Tony's show because sadly I missed it back in the day. I can't remember why I couldn't make it, but I looked at a lot of photographs last summer and I was really taken with the idea that he approached the show as the building is not a container within which artworks get hung. It's like he's addressing the whole infrastructure and the whole history that Zoe was citing all in one fell swoop. And I was just completely blown away and thought about that a lot when I was doing my show. And yeah, I think that's all I'll say about it.
How did you install your show?
Well, at first I wanted to also really address the architecture because I had a lot of problems with the architecture and I was interested in all of the abnormalities of the space and the little strange incidents that happened in the building. And those worked their way into some of the pieces that ended up in the show. But ultimately I'm much less of a sculptor. And so I looked at Fred Sandback in that space and I looked at Tony and I was kind of blown away by what both of them did. But I knew that wasn't the way that I could approach it. So I kind of approached it differently.
Beautifully. I mean, Carrie's show is beautiful. And you also, what I thought was really a little of a conversation between you and Tony was on that back wall where all those plugs were, because it's sort of a long rectangle and you enter at one end. And if I was standing in it right now, this would be a whole bank of windows. And these three are white walls between these big heavy duty columns. And then the back wall is all that limestone block. And what I thought was really interesting was that on that wall where Tony's sculptures were hanging, the clear bottles, slightly shiny with the water against this sort of stone face, just those kind of like materials next to each other in that little piece of wire, right? And that was all glittering up here. Well, in Carrie's show, she hung 7 of them. They were rubbings from the space with the Mylar and removing the Mylar because of the rubbing and taking that imprint of what you can't see, right? And Tony's doing the what you can't see, but I'm going to use them. And then your pieces are also there's a glitterness to it in the sense, or light. There's light play that happens. And again, they were against that stone wall. So I felt like that was a real conversation between both of you. It was like a nod in one hand, but also it's you. And it was really interesting that way. And as was the floor piece, which was Well, you can talk about it. I'm
It was
Go on.
I had a work from 1999 that was a work on panel that I've been going back to older works and reconfiguring them, and so I ripped this piece off of its panel, and it came off in all these shards of reflective mylar and resin. So it came off in about 35 shards, and at first I thought, oh, this is a complete mess. What am I going to do with it? And then I realized that no, that was exactly what was so interesting, that there were these modular, irregular, very sharp, very dangerous looking pieces, and they would sit on the floor in a configuration, and the light would fall on them. And the side that was revealed to the viewer was the side that had always been against the panel, so the verso that the viewer would have never seen previously. But that's about me. I don't want to talk about
Well,
me.
but I want to talk about all of us in a sense. I think that there's a big relationship between Tony's work and all of our works, and there is this kind of consistency there of reusing or installing something in a completely different way, or using materials like Brody in the show in Paris has these cubes, and they're just made from this very, very thin wire, and it talks about the line. And then she has an embedded line of lead. It's about this thick, and it goes around a corner, and it's not slick. There's a handprint in that, the way in which she embeds it. And it's the same line that was used through all of the chapters. But that reuse and reconsideration of material, I think we have that all in common. And I think that was part of the magic of also the friendship in that understanding of each other, There was two things I wanted to go back to was I was thinking about the boxes and how they were, well, I work with a TAG, Treatment Action Group, and I mean, I've always loved those beautiful, the box pieces with the sparkles, and that's what Tony ended up, donating to TAG, this incredible edition, and they were his, HIV med boxes unfolded, right? And what I think is so interesting is, again, and this goes a little bit back to you too, seeing the side of it that you don't see. It was the inside of the box that faced the back, and then the front of it was the part covered in the sparkles, right? So there was that play. And then when we were talking about framing, and I totally agree with him because it's something I cannot deal with, but those pieces framed, which what was her name? She's down in Chelsea. I'm going to remember her name, but they got along like on fire, and she really had it down as ways to frame his work. But I'd gone with him there, and what I thought was so interesting when I finally saw them too is that the sparkles, it comes off, and then there ends up being this little pile in the bottom of the frame. So as much as he didn't want the frame, he's also using the frame, right? Yeah, I don't know. There's something else.
I mean, the other thing I think we all share, we used to do studio visits all the time and look at each other's work all the time and go to each other's shows. Like, we looked at each other's work a lot. And I mean, Tony was like the call, like when I really wasn't sure if something was working, he was like my proofing call. That was the friend. When I'd be like, am I out of my fucking mind? Is this like horrible, or am I onto something? He was that friend because I trusted him. I knew he would tell me the truth, but he would also do it sweetly and kindly, and wouldn't give, it'd be like, all right, that was a really bad idea. It would be fine, go out and have a drink or whatever. But he had that kind of like, again, like this charming kind of joie de vivre, life of the party, very first to arrive always. And absolutely without doubt the very last person you sweep out with your trash at the end of the party. I mean, without fail, like every party and every opening. I mean,
know that because we were there with them.
exactly. Because we'd be swept out with the trash with them. Absolutely. So there was all that. But when it came to art, that was like serious as religion. He was not religious, but that was like no fucking around with that. No, yeah, that was his religion. There was no, you didn't sugarcoat it. He was deeply thoughtful and critical. He had a wide appreciation, but oh boy, if something wasn't, it was and that's something I think is in his work that isn't always, it looks easy. And so sometimes I think it's missed, like what's really there. And I wanted to say something about the beauty of this book, which also feels so appropriate to Tony, not only focusing on the drawings, which allows this side of his work to be seen, his way of thinking, but the lightness of touch of this book, both in the texts and that there's your introduction, which is relatively short, and then there's our conversation. It's not 7 scholarly texts. There's a lightness and there's a leaving space for other things to come. And then there's the design, Joseph Logan. It's so beautiful and again, deceptively simple. That lightness of touch, that sense of kind of you're left wanting a little bit more, that each page has a kind of delicacy and a flow. That's something that doesn't come easy, actually. And I think, you handled his work so beautifully. And this book is so physically beautiful, and it so gets the spirit of his the lightness of that touch, the delicacy of it's really there. So thank you, Joseph, for that.
I
Thank you,
love
Joseph.
that you didn't use font for that you found his name on his own.
Yeah,
So
it's
beautiful.
so good.
I think we're all sort of left wanting more even from this conversation, but we wanted to make sure, at least for a few moments, that we open up to any questions or any comments from the rest of you in the room before we close out.
I want to know if there's any drawing related to the point.
I don't recall having seen any.
That would be really hard to draw. But
Yeah.
some of my favorites.
Yeah.
That's an incredible auto
And that's a good
self-portrait.
connection.
Yeah.
So
Self-portrait.
From when he's born, one every year. Right, so, and
each penny is-
year.
And each penny is dated with that year he found, like the year he was born.
Yeah.
That's the first penny. The second penny is,
Was it 58?
he died at 60, right?
And his
Oh,
year of
yeah.
birth?
58?
56.
Right.
56. So yeah, he'd find a
So he
penny
found a
for each-
coin for each year of his life, a penny,
and
from 56 to
46.
And it's like a drawing, actually.
It's a line.
I think about that too. It's a line. So, and every year, I mean, when Tony was diagnosed, I mean, there was no medication when Tony was, so I think him putting every year was, big deal, adding on to that.
And he built, part of the sculpture was he built a little shelf, this very narrow shelf that was kind of, he looked up like the average human lifespan, whatever that year was, however many, he did some math about that length. And at the time, as Brody said, when he started that piece, thinking he wouldn't survive. Yeah.
But we didn't find any drawings directly about that.
I understand. And there's something, this is something that just occurred to me, and this is maybe the worst place to bring it up, but the one thing that really none of us have touched on yet was his incredible sense of humor,
Yeah.
which that's a very poignant piece. But even that, there's something about like making himself equivalent to like 1 penny, like 1 cent. That's also very Tommy, right? Like there was this like just common denominator and a kind of like, whatever. You know, he wouldn't have been like, oh, it's $100 a year. He's like, it's a penny a year. But throughout these drawings, there's so much humor, so much flirting and boy watching, and so much like, yeah, he was just like a really big flirt, and I think his humor comes through in the drawings very, very clearly. You see it in some of the sculpture, but in the drawings, it's super present. His voice, I can like hear it. I think that's what's so interesting about the drawings. It's Tony live. You know, and that's so exciting. But the other thing we didn't mention is he was a fabulous dresser. And there were certain things that were very standard, and one of them were these little sneakers, the Vans, black. And so in the studio, there was this brick wall, probably what a window was that had been bricked up, and there was a little ledge, and so on the ledge it was just deep enough for the length of his foot, Vans, with maybe, I don't know, 50 pairs that he'd gone through. And so he had just stacked them up, and it was like one of the other stacks. And what I was thinking was where that was located in the studio was also where he had this rack of clothing, because he was very sharp dresses, and he liked very lovely things. And the other thing about that were all the patterns in there, and not only the fabric, the way it felt, but the colors of those things, and all of that runs into his other collections of glassware, all those colors, and the rugs, and velvets, and so all of that too, the color sense is there.
I think about those shoes so often. I think about those shoes, and it wasn't a messy pile. They were all just neatly above each other, but like that didn't ever become a piece.
Mhm.
We don't even know where those shoes are, you know. There were so many moments like that in his studio. Yeah. But I'm just, this whole,
That was, this sense of discernment of what was a piece and what wasn't a piece. And I think for any one of us to walk into the studio, as I think Josh said earlier, you couldn't always find the line between a work in progress, material for other work, and collections. Like there was a lot of
fluid.
objects,
It
right?
was
It
fluid.
really packed. But Tony, once he realized he was going to die much sooner than he wanted to, we spent some time together in the studio, and I was like, all right, let's tell me, what's work, I was like helping him make a record so that we would know, is this little, and it was kind of like incredible, because like one little thing is like, I have this in my apartment, a couple of rusty bolts, a little piece of blue glass, and a little pebble. That was a piece. But like the shoes, not a look. So something that, he was trying, and it was like, again, like no food, but a million tin cans. And you're like, no, that didn't work. I'm trying that for years. Oh, Dixie cups. Oh, yeah, I've been working with it. That hasn't come together yet. So he had a very clear sense of where those things, and where certain things like, I gave up on it, but I just don't want to throw it out yet. And then the collections, he had bought them to throw away. All good. But the collections, Tony was forever like planning to organize them better. but the collections grew faster than any human hand could open boxes. Like, once you could buy stuff on the internet, there's no way your hands could keep up with the amount of ordering that was being done. And so, but there were some cases that he'd set up with the like finest of the finest, and in his apartment, many shelves, like these incredible array of different figurines and icons. But his line of where those things were, there was a lot of discernment. There was connoisseurship, and which wasn't high. It was high and low, but it was specific. And then there was this real discernment between what was a work and what was working, what might become a work, and what was still kind of like, I don't know about that. And that was really interesting. Yeah.
There's so much that you don't get to try. I mean, his love of gardening, but I can just go on. Were there other questions?
Is that a
You
good
guys
place?
have anything else to say?
So much, but I just want to also invite people to take a good look at the book. Of course, we're also now waiting with bated breath for Zoe and Joy's book of photographs from the studio. So no pressure.
Greg.
Tony, we love you. Miss you.
All right, next project is pulling all of our heads out of our own ass.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks, everyone. Picture of the room.
There's so much more. Like,
There's so much.
it's hard to continue.
You all are
to just
amazing.
go on.
You are amazing. Like, just like listening, it's amazing. You realize that the interview in the book is just like, you recognize it's just a slice.
Oh, I think the shot, or you know what, if you want to have a look through it, that's fine. Go for it. Yeah.
Talk about it.